What an extraordinary day this has been, and I think that this group gets the prize. 10 straight hours in the Bancroft Hotel on Israeli and Palestinian Waterways. Pretty good. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. As this is the last time I'll come up, I just want to really extend some thanks where they're due. First, it has really been a seamless day, in large part because of the work of Kelly at the Bancroft Hotel and her entire staff. So I don't know if Kelly's around, but let's cheer loudly enough so that she can hear us in the back. And you've heard it a bunch today, but there are a few people without whom this conference, from soup to nuts, from procedure to substance, simply would never have happened. And the visionary behind the conference, the person who thought about its progression, the way it would move through the day, the way in which Palestinian, Israeli, and other international scholars could be brought together in meaningful dialogue and in a way that can create partnerships that will go forward and that I hope the Berkeley Institute will be a central partner in. The person with all of that vision has been Miri Lavi Nehemiah. And once again, in terms of making sure that the vision, both in its substance and in its practicalities, made it to where we could be today, I'd like to thank Freda Olivares and the events team of the law school. I don't know if David Grady is still here, but thanks to him as well. To Andrei Dubinsky and Shir Davidovich, who have been working for months to make this happen. I know many phone calls and emails from all of you. And to our leader at the Institute, Rebecca Goldberg, our executive director, for and we've mentioned a number of times today how important and crucial it's been that this day has been a partnership between so many colleges, units, and other centers on campus. There is one set of thanks I saved until the end of today, which is the thanks that's due to the UC Berkeley School of Law and to our Dean, Jillian Lester. The law school is a place which, unlike many, sends out several important messages to all who are involved. Those messages include the law school is a place for innovative thinking, dramatic window closing. The law school is a place where the usual boundaries that constrain inquiry should be shunned, and new ways of dialogue, new ways of connection, new approaches to interdisciplinarity should be emphasized, and the interests of those who are part of our community should be fostered, and when you have an idea, run with it. And these approaches are embodied in the approach and the encouragement and the support that Dean Lester and all of the leadership of the law school set forth and give to us every single day. Dean Lester has a long biography, a doctorate from Stanford, a JD degree from the University of Toronto. She's a leading scholar in the law of employment, both in the United States and internationally. Today, I hail her and welcome her, and I hope you will too, as an inspirational leader who leaves space for members of our community to do great things, and I think this conference was really great. Julie.
Thank you, Ken, for such a lovely introduction, and more generally, thank you for giving me the distinct honor of welcoming everybody on behalf of Berkeley Law School to this culminating event of our day-long conference on Israeli and Palestinian waterways, where we've had a wonderful opportunity to examine the significance of such compelling issues, the significance of natural resources in Israel and the Middle East, at a critical juncture of environmental law, politics, and society. Today, the participants in this conference have engaged in stimulating and really vital and cutting-edge conversations about historical issues in water law and border formation, social questions of scarcity, access, and health, questions of transboundary peace and conflict resolution, and critical questions about the impact of changing technology. Now, I have been given the great honor of introducing our keynote speaker. Before I accept that mantle, I want to take a few minutes. I know there have been many, many thanks today, but I will have the final opportunity to offer thanks in a way that allows me to embrace the great virtue of being part of the Berkeley community. Because this conference embodies the great potential, the great capacity of this community. And I really want to thank the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israeli Studies for pulling together in a way that really just leverages the tremendous, explosive potential of this interdisciplinary community by bringing together so many sponsors and so many participants. So I'd like to thank all of those sponsors and participants, the College of Natural Resources. Just listen to this list. The Goldman School of Public Policy, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Friends of the Arava Institute, the College of Environmental Design, the Blum Center for Developing Economies, the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, and the Wheeler Institute for Water Policy, and the Institute for International Studies. That is spectacular to pull us all together and have a conversation about these most vital issues affecting global problems. So I really want to honor Berkeley and its capacity, and honor the Berkeley Institute for Jewish and Israeli Studies for being able to spearhead this wonderful, wonderful conversation. So let me then turn to the introduction of our keynote speaker for this evening. Glenn Yago is a leading authority on financial innovations, capital markets, emerging markets, and environmental finance. Glenn's work focuses on the innovative use of financial instruments to solve long-standing economic development and social and environmental challenges. Glenn runs the Milken Institute Israel Center, overseeing a range of activities devoted to accelerating Israel's economic growth, building social and economic gaps, and securing Israel's global competitiveness and financial technology transfer that increases the impact of government policy, philanthropy, and private sector investment. As part of Glenn's work, he directs the Milken Institute Fellows Program, which places graduates in internships related to financial reform and economic development projects. Glenn's also a senior fellow and founder of the Institute's Financial Innovation Labs, And these labs have been credited with crafting breakthrough financial policies and programs for institutional investors, foundations, development programs, and governments that address such diverse problems: urban revitalization, catastrophic risk, affordable housing, small business financing, water infrastructure, climate change, healthcare, and archaeological site preservation. Now, prior to joining the Institute, Glenn served as a professor at the State University of New York's Stony Brook and the City University of New York Graduate Center in the PhD program in economics. And he's also a visiting professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So we'll now turn to hear Glenn's keynote, which builds on today's discussions in the context of a real project and test case: the Israeli-Palestinian collaborative project to treat the wastewater in the Kidron Valley Wadi El-Nar River Basin, which is an ambitious transboundary environmental, architectural, and economic project with significant implications for thinking about water, technology, and peace. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Yaga.
Thank you. It's really a privilege and honor and no small challenge to be here today, especially following such an extraordinary program. I just want to add the praise and the gratitude to all of the folks, Rebecca and Miri and Ken. It's been several months since we met outside our office in the streets of Jerusalem, and we went up and spent some time talking with my colleagues, and we had just still had the posters up from doing a briefing for the quartet that had come through to talk about. You'll see some of these pictures, and within 2 weeks, one of my colleagues who's worked on this, a great architect, Liora Meron, was here in Berkeley, and you guys were quickest in terms of picking up this subject and the challenges that we've worked on. I guess just like that old line about standing on the shoulders of giants, historically, this conversation since last evening, when the graduate students started presenting their report, the ability, I think, in terms of the way you were talking about constructing a conversation, as Ken mentioned, a dialogue, was remarkable in this conference. And to go into a layered approach that able to overcome many problems of language between disciplines. I'm usually used to them more in terms of geography, but to understand things that usually I always thought economists were the people that could make the obvious obscure through their language. But I appreciate everyone's patience. When we would talk, and I'd ask Musa a question, or Samir, or somebody else about, and not about a question in Arabic, but a question in terms of categories of language that were being used in their work. It's a really brilliant and very interesting mode to talk about. So there are 3 things that I'm going to do in this talk this evening. And I really like to talk about this project and our work and the work with colleagues, Munter, who's been at our labs in Jerusalem with other colleagues, and also Clive and other people that have been very key in working, David Silverman, who've been with us working on biodiversity issues and the issues about ecosystem services. There's a whole range of projects here that we can talk about that would keep students, faculty, and citizens busy for a long time in terms of solving these problems. So this is going to be layered in terms of starting with a general overview about the connection between environment as a bridge, as the talk is titled, green bridges over troubled waters, and imagining that and of how those solutions could be manifested and materialized. Then we're going to drill down into a tour of the Kidron River Valley, which I would encourage you all to make and invite you. All the people who have been working on the steering committee, which crosses boundaries, if not, since we don't have borders yet on that side of things. We have many borders, A, B, C, etc. But but the ability to come down and to see the Kidron River Valley as just one of the watersheds and one of the river basins that need to be dealt with in this tiny region that we share. And so we're going to go take that tour, and then I'll really try to make your eyes glaze over by going into some of the finance issues. What is the capital structure? How do we finance this? And what was interesting to me about hearing so much of the science and the technology is the way in which cost avoidance and benefit cost analysis can be brought to bear on these projects to come up with new sets of solutions that would enable the types of dialogues to talk into the types of structures that will deliver the ability for a successful existence of two states for two people in that region. So, which is the declared intent of everybody's government. So, it should happen speedily in our time, and bigab v'yameinu, inshallah. So, with that issue about of shared sovereignty in different areas, and combining those sovereignties, and dealing with sub-sovereign things that can be done in order to create the communities and create the trust and create the believability of how the future is possible. And I know there's a lot of criticism about technological optimism or different types of optimism today. And I was just reminded by our president's comment. He's over 90 now, and President Harris always says that that pessimists and optimists die the same way, they just live differently. So, so our hope is that we can try to build upon that. So here, what you have before you is the Kidron River Valley. It's really the Great Divide in American terms. It's a continental divide. If a drop of water falls on this side, these dotted lines show you the tributaries of the Kidron, and then if it's on this side, this is over here by the people who know Jerusalem, Keren HaYesod. If it drops on one side of Keren HaYesod, it goes to the Mediterranean. If it drops on the other side of Keren HaYesod Street, it goes to the Dead Sea. And you go from Har Tzofim, where I teach, and some of the other folks here teach at the Hebrew University, goes down through there. It goes through Geben Chinom, Gehinnom in Yiddish, those of you who want to follow that. It was an early site, archaeological site that was quite fascinating. Also, this part of the tributary, which goes through the old city, which was the Tyropian Way in Roman archaeology, made famous by the life of Brian as blessed are the cheesemakers. That was I'm not going to talk about peacemakers today. That was the cheesemaker's way. That was the archaeology of this is very interesting. And what we're going to be talking about is combining not only waterways, but talking about cultural heritage resources, talking about agriculture, talking about all the things that are wasting away because of the absence of this wastewater treatment plant, and how that can be solved. So what we try to deal with in the work that we're doing of the steering committee, and I should mention I am here as an emissary of this wonderful steering committee, which includes all the different communities, all the different interdisciplines that are involved in this, from architecture to hydrology to you name it. Any profession that you train here at Berkeley is engaged there. And I guess the last part of the talk is going to be a call to action. As I was going to tell you what I was going to tell you, I'm going to tell it to you. You'll have it. So this idea of vision, or imagining, or visioning things is very important. And then what the tools and the analysis are, and the implementation, and it's again, as we were saying, how do we look at this through the lens of finance or other disciplines in order to come up with solutions? So we see the world, what we're looking at is how the world is. And this was, Musa made this point very clearly yesterday in his talk. So I thought it was how the world is, and how would we like it to be? And it requires these things to come together. Now, this is a quotation from Robert Costanzo, who's an ecological economist that we had for a workshop over in Jerusalem recently. And I really liked the way he talked about the world is a complex, non-linear adaptive systems with thresholds, tipping points, and surprises. And he wasn't talking about the Middle East. He was talking about all these other places on the planet, which are precisely where these environmental problems are concentrated and refracted. Of course, in our little region, all these things are refracted to the power of 100. This is the sort of classic neoclassical view of economics. So, economics, get a PhD in economics to kind of take you don't get it all in Econ 101, you have to take all these different courses, but this was a way to try to look at it, looking at property rights, public and private, to looking at what are substitutability factors between factors of production, or the production function and the factors that go into it. This was the empty worldview of neoclassical economics that we lived with for many years, that lead to an economic process, lead to the creation of gross domestic product, of the total amount of goods and services, to consumption and the optimization of everybody's utility curve and how that works, and investment and savings all kind of combined together. That's the empty world vision. But I forgot who was mentioning about the full world vision today, of looking, is Alon top? Is Alon still here? Yeah. So, okay, so that view of it is a little bit different. The full world vision of the whole system is something that engages looking at all the various facets of capital, looking at built capital, the built environment, looking at social capital, looking at human ability, and look at the limited, and especially what we're talking about here is natural capital. Those types those aspects of the environment which come together that have limited sustainability between different capital forms, but we have to find out some ways of valuing them so that they can come into the system. They're not simply externalities, but they're integrated into the system of understanding the economic production process, and those economic process creates goods and services and also creates waste. And what do we do with the waste? This is sort of the question. What do we do with the radon in the water out of the fossil reservoirs? Or what do we do with other sorts of things that are that, and how that runs into ways of trying to finance things and comes up with ways of looking at different evolving cultural norms and policies that can create solutions as opposed to problems. And I guess one little notes I wrote to myself is people kept saying, why has this taken so long? And having worked on these problems for, I guess, at this point up with the third or the fourth Palestinian water commissioner, and God knows how many Israeli water commissioners as well, is that there's, or other people involved, be they NGOs or be other places, is how much there's a system in which people are invested in the problems rather than investing in the solutions. They're investing in the problems because problems have a higher rate of return. So we have to invert that process. So this is a general, again, theory about the connections between built capital, social capital, and human capital, which are within the natural capital system, within what are environmental services, ecosystem services that David Silverman has done pioneering work on, and how that can sustain human well-being and the ability of people to realize their dreams. So this engages all sorts of services that don't get monetized. I mean, things like pollination, things like recreation, things like medicine that come out of that from the discoveries in the Guacanate National Park in Costa Rica or other places that have come up with medical cures, and the ways that in these economic services, through supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services, actually create the conditions for well-being and for people to be able to solve problems and exist as. So what are these different functions that have to be described, have to be calibrated, have to be measured, have to be inventoried? They're the provisioning functions of the environment in terms of water supply, food, medical resources, fiber, minerals, tools, timber, fuel, and so forth. The various regulation functions. We had that big snowstorm back in December, and once again, because we haven't observed the importance of riverbanks and protecting them, flood protection. So you close down the Ayalon freeway for a day or two, and the cost of that is not really monetized within the system. Climate stability, waste treatment, soil erosion, biological control, many of the things that were mentioned by presentations during the day. And the various supporting functions, which include pollination, biodiversity, habitat, nutrient recycling, net primary production that takes place. And then what is the hugest asset of the region, both in Israel and Palestine, the various cultural functions. The beauty that you saw in the Kidron River Valley, the recreational functions, the spiritual fact. I mean, the fact that the Judean desert is much more important than Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the outcome of, depending on your theology, whether God is discovered, God discovers man, or man discovers God. It happens in the desert. It happens Esham B'Midbar. It happens in Sinai, or it happens when Muhammad comes to Jabal Mukhaber, or Omar comes and cites the place of where the prophet rises, or the place where St. John baptizes Jesus at Castellia. These are all great archaeological, so all these sites, there are 30,000 archaeological sites in Palestine or the land of Israel, whatever you might wish to call it. And in those areas, it can drive enormous amount of values because, as we keep saying about the Kidron River Valley, you'll see it in a slide in a minute, there's 350,000 people there, but there's about 3.5 billion people that it matters to in terms of a location that defines what their culture, science, education, all of these. Now here's something from Aaron Wolf's database to talk about all the different international river basins, and you'll notice all of them are transboundary. All of them cross political boundaries and jurisdictions. And he had also participated at the lab we did in 2009. And this basic idea, just for those other folks that aren't that deeply ingrained in it, another slide, this is not the Sumerian highlands coming down to the water plant in Tel Aviv here, but this basic notion of how the water cycle works and how things are replenished and how that cycle becomes valued and those ecosystem services are valued. That's particularly refracted in the Kidron Valley, just in terms of this sort of historical art that I thought you'd find interesting, and tell you about where we are as we start to take this tour through the Kidron River Valley. It goes back to the Hesponian water system from that archaeology goes from 950 BC forward. This is the way it looks today. It actually was still operating until 1948, parts of the Hesponian water system. This is an archaeologist up near Goran, who's, we did a lot of survey tours as we put together this project. And this was the steering committee for basin management, at least on the Israeli side, but it also engaged some of our Palestinian colleagues from the city of Ubadia, from Engineers Without Borders and other places, and they are putting together, you can see the vast array of different, in terms of drainage, in terms of demography, in terms of planning, all of the different facets and professions that have to come together to solve this problem. This is a picture I showed you before. Just keep that in mind as we start to take the tour. And what it converts into was an action plan or the beginnings of one that we've been discussing and have high hopes for. This just gives you, we did lots of surveys looking through all the ecological and archaeotourism sites that were there. We go out on Fridays, survey them, try to look at, build that map, get directions from Bedouins that when we get lost in the field. This I had to put up because Pete Taylor, who some of you know, who's the CFO of the California system for the Chancellor, he came over in 2009 for the lab that we did because he's one of the most incredible infrastructure bankers. He had been at Lehman Brothers and at Barclays, and to help us with this. So this report's on our website in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. Very proud we were able to get it. And the prophetic-looking guy there heads up the environmental ministry for the municipality of Jerusalem. And this is the sort of picture that those of you who were here last night saw a really great slide that Musa had up comparing both the watershed consciousness that we're trying to build versus what the jurisdictional boundaries are. And as you can see, it's a mess between the West Bank, parts of the Palestinian Authority, the civil administration, all the different ministries on the Israeli side, the drainage authority, the local authorities, the different river authorities for each river. It's hard to sort out. So how do we make sense of this? Well, first of all, you have to, I think making people feel secure is very important. So when we first started going down to Al-Ubadia, the mayor wanted to make us feel secure, which is always a little tough problem, I have to admit, for Americans or Israelis, to go down and be protected by Palestinian policemen, but it works. And so they had a whole platoon there as we were going to look at various siting places for the wastewater treatment plant. This is what we were talking about, and that Muntar was talking about, the problem of septic systems, of throwing black plastic in the bottom of a hole and throwing some sheet metal on top of it, and it goes into the groundwater. So there are 8,000 to 10,000, I think, in the survey of septic systems like this that need to get. This is a problem that needs to get fixed. This is not wastewater management. But there we sat and started to develop, brought in the maps, brought in some of the information technology. Again, at the time we were going down there, putting this young policeman in with the gun in the room as we were looking at the maps made me a little nervous. But in any case, you get used to it. And it was there, and there's Ari Rachamimov and Mohammed Nakal from Isafia, and the city engineer from Olubadia, the water engineer from Jerusalem, trying to work out and to look and to sort through these various problems. So basically, the Kidron is simply an example of 5, I think it's really up to 10 if you count all the various streams of the various waterways that cross through Israel and Palestine. And this takes you from the upper region down to the lower region, which takes you through zones A, B, and C under the current bifurcations that go on, which really takes you through 4 different legal jurisdictions. So no small problem is that. But yet look at this enormous number of resources that exist there, from the Theodosius Monastery, where the doctrine of the Trinity was written, of Marsaba, which was the home of the monastic orders that was emulated from actually the monastic orders that came out of Qumran from the Essenes prior to that, but when Constantine turns the empire to be Catholic, the real Christians go to the desert to find God again. And Marsaba came down from Cappadocia. It's an incredible place. The monks who are there are incredible human beings. And as are all of the people that are within the Kidron. There's Mount Muntar, where the scapegoat, all these stories really drive into a cultural phenomenon of understanding scapegoats, because we're talking about all these, if I use some of the postmodern language I learned in the morning, we have all these narratives that overlap each other that try to cancel each other out, as opposed to narratives that can really reveal to us an inclusive rather than an exclusive version of how life can be. And that's, I think, the point of discovery and the problem of how refracting and solving this problem allows us to create something remarkable in this area. So this is the way it looks. It's just a beautiful area. We'll start up from the upper basin by the King David Hotel, those of you who've been there, and take you down towards, and you'll see the little point on the map here, in the river basin and the watershed, where you can follow your path. So here we're going towards the separation fence, and this is the pathway of the sewage that we'll see that comes down and collects more sewage, both from East Jerusalem. It was 63% is not connected in East Jerusalem. Virtually nothing's connected in Bet Sahur, very little in Lechem. This takes you to a place that people go to Nepal or Bhutan to see things like this. And it's 20 minutes outside of Jerusalem, if that. And a really remarkable structure and a remarkable place. And down into the lower parts of the basin, which, by the way, is part of the ecological flyway of over 500,000 birds a year that go through that area. So enormous opportunities in terms of monetizing ecotourism into that region. And here's what happens because of the lack of any kind of, well, this is what happens when it storms into the lower basin, what goes into the Dead Sea. And basically, as Tom Friedman wrote in his column about this the other day, it's a good thing the Dead Sea is already dead, given what we deliver to it right now. And in terms of, but what are the goals of this master plan? It's to create a quality area between the old city, central Jerusalem, and the Dead Sea, to look at the stream really as a bridge between political entities and cultures and solve this Kidron sewage problem. It involves a lot of different communities. It involves a quality of life for everyone. Renews the connection between Jerusalem and the Judean wilderness. And again, the importance of the wilderness as it goes further into the history of the perfume road or the spice road and all the areas that connect the regions of that area. This is basically the problem, I think, the problem, but also the reality of the building up of the area and the population increases over the last 80 years. This gives you a sense of what the environmental and ecological nuisances are, and sort of the slogan of the Ministry of Economic Protection, how do we turn those nuisances, those ecological disasters, into resources? That means both in terms of solid waste and in terms of liquid waste. But you can see that the areas have been turned into dumps. There's dumps all over the place that are unregulated. And the question is how can we start to both recycle that solid waste and recycle the sewage waste to create a resource? This is the general plan. We identified over 57 different economic projects that could be done there. This involved having meetings about it with various community stakeholders, from the Greek Patriarchate down to people in Clara, in Umtuba, in Subasha, all the areas down in the descent of the river, and presenting the ideas and gathering ideas about it. This was an attempt at a sulha that was done in 2012 with here you see Shaddad Attili, who was now the gone water commissioner. He served there. Mayor Suleiman, Amr Rabaya, Engineer Rabaya, who's from Engineers Without Borders, Professor Reuben Laster, who heads our steering committee, and this was done right on the river, which is raw sewage. So, and it was a hot day, and it smelled pretty bad. And but the idea is to try to get everyone to understand and to recognize the problem. Whether they go back to Ramallah or they go back to Jerusalem, and that it needs to be solved. It represents about 1/3 of Jerusalem's sewage of about 30,000 cubic meters a day that flows downstream from Wadi al-Nahr and the Kidron without any type of treatment. About 15,000 cubic meters of sewage from Bet Lechem and from the Bet Sahor region that flows down into the stream every day. It gets you to about 15 million cubic meters per year. This can all be turned into treated effluent and agricultural water. And plus, this violates every law in the lands. It violates Israeli law, it violates international law in terms of cross-boundary, and it violates the law in the Israeli-administered West Bank in terms of Area C, and it violates Palestinian law. So this is just wrong and has to be fixed. This shows you what comes out of Bet Sahor and from Bet Lechem. This shows you the river underpass from the Wadi Nar Road. Again, the example that I think that Clive also showed, we're poisoning animals and people in the process as well. These are all avoidable problems. This is from the Hyrcania Valley, from the old Hasmonean fort, which is really worth going to see. But this shows you everything that flows down in terms of the plastic and the refuge. And these were the two different versions or possibilities of what could be done. This was the plan that you may have read about that the Dutch just shut down. It was supposed to be built in, there were two plans, actually there were three plans. The original plan was to take all the sewage from West Jerusalem and ship it back up to the Sorek Park, which is a beautiful park, and there's already a sewage plant there. It cost about 5 times as much because both Palestinians and Israelis have to deal with the laws of gravity. The law of gravity is that sewage runs downhill, and to pump it back up is really not an economic viable. So we're able to show that the solution that was up here somewhere was no solution at all. This solution has not gone forward, and this was an agreed upon, a consensus siting of the plant that would be near Al-Ubadia. And what's interesting about it is you'll see you have A, and you have B, and you have C. And wherever you want to draw the future borders, as opposed to boundaries, I guess we probably ought to talk about hydrological boundaries and political borders. So we don't have a border. We have we have 3 different borders. But wherever you would want to put the political boundary of the state of Palestine relative to the state of Israel, it really doesn't matter. This plant has to be built. Or a plant does need to be built in order to do that. And this is nothing that can wait any longer. This has been going on since Oslo. No progress has been made. And it's clearly a problem that can be solved and that the means to do so are. But this just shows you again the area, the different points. There's a gravity pipeline that would be coming up and a pressurized pipeline that would go over to the side of the plant. I've walked through that. This was a very interesting, people were talking about property rights. So Mohammed Nakal from Isafia went down and actually worked with the different people that live in those different areas to actually map out, you'll see here, this drawing right here, where, whoops, what did I just, okay. This basically shows you all the different families and maps out what property rights were. And the question was asked, the folks in that area, would they give up parts of their property rights in order to build the pipeline through that in exchange for agricultural water, which they agreed to. And this would be where you would put the plant. And these are other different projects for implementation that could go through in terms of the wastewater treatment. You have to treat the sewage first, and then all sorts of other revenues start to accumulate. You start to monetize all of the various assets, the ecotourism and other things, and drive traffic down there. You start to, the idea of having like a park, as somebody was mentioning in the case of the Golan, much more realistic here, of where you have a park entry down by Nebi Musa, which is a Muslim holy site, and people can have, again, tours through the area, communications and educational initiative, different rehabilitations and preservation of the Marsaba area, many different projects. Again, this was only 11 of the projects we're ready to move forward on in the next few years, and then many others behind that. Many community initiatives started to organize around it. It's really interesting when you throw a rock into this pond. Recently, I took a guest down who was over for down to Marsaba, and there were 50 mountain bikes. In fact, there was a mountain bike tour down through where the bike path will go on the opposite side from Marsaba. It was an amazing thing to see. These are women in East Jerusalem who organized different environmental projects in terms of the area because they want to make sure that something happens with the trash, that they're having access to clean water. This is the school in Surbacher, which is creating, who built this idea of the Kidron River Valley. And they actually then took this model and took it over to an Israeli high school in East Tel Aviv. And there's a growing sort of notion of this idea of a watershed consciousness there, and of these initiatives that take place. The other great thing in Jerusalem is the deputy mayor there, Nomi Tzur, had organized this idea of green pilgrimages, again, what are the stakeholders that are involved in this area are all the people that come to Jerusalem, people that want to go pray at Al-Aqsa, or that come for all the Christian festivals, and come for the three major Jewish holidays that have pilgrimage to the Aliyah al-Rega, to go up to Jerusalem. So this idea of a basin plan which creates a basin-wide perception, which creates a number of projects, a coordination with different stakeholders, cooperations with the Palestinians in a multi-year and system-wide perspective, that's what we have tried to pull together. So let me now, with that tour, just tell you a little bit about how do you finance something like this. How do you go from close to 50 million metric cubes of raw sewage into creating assets out of that? And what are the costs of collection, treating, and the handling of the sewage? This is all up on our website on a report we released in July. And how do we build really a capital structure that enables you to finance it? Well, first of all, what are the different assets? You have the water and sewage treatment, which is the underlying aspect. You have solid waste, because you can recycle the solid waste. That's the second big moneymaker, which will finance, as long as you build ring fence it, and the resources of recovery of solid waste or of liquid waste go back to the region, go back to the project. You have heritage and cultural heritage and tourism, recreational tourism, education, agriculture, and economic and community development. It's about these are all in shekels, by the way, but it's basically about a $100 billion project and some change, which is very cheap if you think about what the asset that you're creating in that whole area. You combine the history and recreation, you cross all kinds of borders. As I mentioned before, this region represents 300,000 residents of two different nations, and again about 3.5 billion people that have an interest in that area. So the concept, there is this, now we're going to start talking about the governance, because you have to govern, the things you have to govern here, or how you finance it, how you create the cash flows, and how you create the assets out of the liabilities. The liability is obvious. So how do we convert those into something that's an asset? Well, first of all, it's the construction of the sewage plant is primary, because as long as we started, one of the little phrases we said, you have to forgive my language on it, that since the peace process went to shit, we should probably clean that up first. So the idea of building the wastewater treatment plant is absolutely key and a key aspect of infrastructure. That generates operating revenues, which goes to a special purpose vehicle, a wonderful corporate farm, which allows you to ring fence and keep that cash flow and do that. Then on a secondary level, you start to build other revenue streams that come from new business development and growth, special district fees, special tax fees that are, when you go to San Francisco, I guess it's true here in Berkeley too, or the hotel bill that you pay a tourism district tax. You don't do that in Jerusalem. You don't do that in Bethlehem. You do not do that at any of the places that a lot of ecotourism and spiritual tourism and other forms of tourism could drive to. It's interesting, the monks down in Marsaba have about 150 of these little areas that, like, people go to, what's that area in Arizona where they go for spiritual retreats? Sedona, okay. Well, the original Sedona was in the River Valley. People would go down there, and so they're looking around to see if they could open them up and charge to, that were the hermitage places where people would go. So those revenues of special district fees would go back to the special purpose vehicle. And then those would cycle to project financing, which would then go to yet other types of projects. So the financing model is really to deal with both the wastewater treatment works, the non-point pollution control management, cleanup and remediation and conservation program. By the way, you can also go to the end of the Good Samaritan on your way back from Nebi Musa, right on the main road back to Jerusalem. All these different sites come together. We're talking about gray water or compost sales, methane gas sales, different energy sales that could come out of that, different public fees, tap-in fees, flushing fees, drainage fees that could be paid either by donors if there's an income limitation, or also improvement taxes, recreational fees, use fees, business licenses, and the business growth that would come from these tax increments that would, or event fees. I mean, you start to have concerts down there. It's not so far-fetched. I mean, you see that all the time. Assad is already having concerts, or over in the Khiria, in the old dump Ariel Sharon Park, where everything was on Crown land from the British Mandate. That's become an income area, and it used to be a dump. So these are not far-fetched ideas, and we see it all the time. So the capital structure that you build in order to do this is one which tries to draw and pool these different, and just like you're pooling water together, you have to pool the finances together in a way. You have different layers of capital, both the senior debt at about 67% of a revenue bond. I won't go through all these terms because it's not going to be a technical presentation of the business case for this. A level of subordinated debt, credit enhancement that could come from the EU, from OPIC, from the World Bank, for partial guarantees. Whoops, let me go back to this here. Market equity, because this actually over a couple of decades, 15 to 20-year financing, and then social equity that could come in as well. Impact investment is what we call it. What $650 billion in philanthropies sit in, we see this as an example of a type of financial product that can be launched that has a triple bottom line. It has a financial return, it has a social return, and it has an environmental return. So a lot of philanthropies would invest in this under the principles of impact investing, which are becoming more common, or even also program-related investments that can come in and provide the credit enhancement or the first loss protection. So the operating financing assumptions, and I'll just do this very quickly, are both from direct services that Jerusalem, when I flush my toilet in West Jerusalem, that I pay every time to the Gihon. They've been gathering those revenues for quite some time and haven't been spending it on a sewage water treatment plant. And you have, so you have direct sale that goes also, that would go to the Palestinian Authority that could be paid at what the rate is, that 55 agorot per cubic meter that would be paid to the Palestinian water company. So you have Israeli services and Palestinian services both deliver the treated water sales that turn into operating revenues, and then reserve funding, which allows you to build that coupled with supplemental fees and assessment on international tourists. You're not taxing Palestinians or Israelis, you're taxing the pilgrims, which, by the way, they've been doing since the Second Temple period. So that's nothing new in that. It's the shekel. So, and it's been done, was done during the whole period since St. Helena started building pilgrimage sites. So these are the assumptions. I'm not going to bore you with this. Let's move on to the numbers, but they're all in the report. It's on the website, and you can spend some time going over it. There are risks obviously involved. Here's the project checklist. Here's where we are right now, is trying to get the full the full idea of the impact statements and the revenue estimates put together. And this is very important, to create a regional district, a sub-sovereign governance structure, which sacrifices nobody's sovereignty of either state to actually deal with the specific special purpose problem. To assemble the project team, form a project company, we jokingly talk about it as the Holy Land, Holy Water Authority. And so that special authority can actually be used in order to manage the revenues for that, to clean up the contaminated, ongoing polluted river basin, to provide a regional community and economic asset for economic growth, and for project financing that is self-financing. It does self-finance if you run all the numbers as we have for a cross-boundary environmental and infrastructure project. So the governance structure, I just want to talk about this because we brought David Backer from Earth Economics up in Seattle over to look at the work we've done. And I just want to bring it back to the Bay Area for a moment. How am I doing on time? I guess okay. The idea of a watershed investment district is not new. This idea of creating some type of governance structure that does this has been done before, just as in Alan Wolf's data set and the examples that David's hosted here, from the Mekong Delta to river basins in Africa, to the Danube, to the St. Lawrence Waterways, to the Rio Grande. We talked about the examples that were given today by Professor Magdala about the North American Development Bank and the River Conservation Authority for the Rio Grande in terms of, and Itai talked about that as well. But there's lots of areas where this idea is taking place, and it's being done in several different geographies. He gave the example of what they did up in Washington State. Again, here's another basin, and this is where the call to action comes in, because we don't have enough manpower to do this. How do we inventory all the different provisioning assets? How do we look at the beneficiaries or the impairments that go on? How do we actually do that? This was done in the Green Duwamish River watershed. And the type of maps you have to build are provisioning maps, beneficiary maps. You like this one, because you have to look at the quantification of the water supply, the cultural value, the value of waste treatment and removal, monetize the flood protection, and the aesthetic value, the sediments flow, the wildlife and biodiversity, the recreation, all these different things that occur, and to try to actually do that. Now, if we come back to the Bay Area, what is the cost of not doing this? I thought this example was particularly good. So this is Santa Clara, right? We were just, last week we were down with the Prime Minister and the Governor signing this memorandum of understanding. I was happy that I joked with, emailed back to my colleagues back in Israel and Palestine that we've worked out a deal between California and Israel. A final status agreement. And we should move so quickly and back in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. But this was done down in Mountain View, and so the idea of what goes on down in the Santa Clara area in terms of the creation of an open space authority. The Santa Clara County has actually established one of these. So what's the value of Silicon Valley to the global economy? And so I just want to make the same case for our little Kidron River Valley as well. Here's what happened with we're talking about aquifer regeneration as one of the things that has to happen. Here's what was happening with groundwater withdrawals that were occurring and subsidence that was going on down in Silicon Valley. So you can imagine if those sinkholes that you looked at in the Dead Sea started appearing in Silicon Valley, and then here's their idea of trying to deal with groundwater recharge, of aquifer remediation, of wastewater recycling, and all those other factors there. So, I guess with that I'm going to conclude, because with this this Kidron Water Action Plan, as you say around here in California, si se puede, or yes we can, or Yaholu Halna from Yeshua ben Nun in Hebrew, or Na'am Nastatea in Arabic. So we can do this. Thank you.
As you said, 350 million shekels, whatever it is for an infrastructure project, is a relatively small change. The Israeli government could fund it out of general revenues. Alternatively, I think the figure you threw out was 150 million square meters a year of raw sewage. Going down, that means an equivalent amount of water being turned on from the taps, presumably.
Right. You're creating water.
Right, so at the rates we pay to to the Jerusalem Water Company, I'm resident of Jerusalem as well. That's 1 year's revenues from that 150 million cubic meters is more than enough to build the plant. So why the complicated governance structure, financing vehicles, and all that? It seems like government could do this tomorrow if it wanted to.
Well, you can't because of all the various jurisdiction involved. So the idea of creating a special district authority, that was a big discovery, I think, in the United States of having special purpose districts, of sewage districts, and in this case of a watershed investment district. is because you have to go through lots of jurisdictions that we don't even know where they are right now completely, and there's clear differences of authority in different areas. So to get people to cooperate, you have to align in any financial structure what you're trying to do, or any political structure. You're trying to align incentives so that people will move in the same direction. So if you have a tourism improvement district, of which parts of those revenues from tourism go both to the Palestinian Authority or to the various localities or to the municipality of Jerusalem, the government of Jerusalem on the Palestinian side, to promote infrastructure which will drive traffic, economic development in those areas, you start to get that effect. Economics is always this allocation of scarce resources among alternative desirable ends. So what the goals are this idea of trying to create some structure that will allow that. And given that kind of those lines and all those very multiple jurisdictions which make it ungovernable, what we've had is we've had both state failure and we've had pre-state failure. We had state failure in Israel to deal with this problem. I mean, the liability is on the mayor of Jerusalem. He is being sued by the Ministry of Environment for the violation of Israeli law because of this. That's why the municipality of Jerusalem is interested in solving the problem. It violates Palestinian law, it violates the laws in the relative to the civil administration. So it's just, it doesn't, there's been state failure, and then on the Palestinian Authority side, I don't know, I let my colleagues there, there's been pre-state failure too. I mean, it's not like that as Mayor Suleiman said at the tent meeting, you know, you guys can go back to Ramallah, but we're still here looking at sewage flowing. And it smells, it's a public health hazard. It's not a resource for Palestinian agriculture. It's part of the Palestinian National Agricultural Plan, requires a lot more water than they're getting in that area for low water agriculture. And that's where you start to create this. So there's not a governance structure. The default, this is basically, the governments have defaulted. So what do you do when a government?
I don't want to have the mic, but just a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
So the factors that you identify as causing state and pre-state failure, which are largely about overlapping and unclear jurisdictions, it seems to me might also cause market failure. So if you're talking about setting up, especially talking about setting up a multi-agency, multi-armed structure that you diagrammed, so that every step of the way, every one of those arrows.
It goes back to the special purpose authority, or maybe a corporation.
Right, you're talking about collecting a tourism tax in Bethlehem, and as well as tourism tax in Jerusalem and one somewhere else, and as well as monetizing various projects, and somehow all those crossing those same jurisdictional boundaries, right?
Right.
To get back to this one investment vehicle.
Right.
So those boundaries have to be overcome either way.
I'm sorry?
Those boundaries have to become either way, whether you're talking about public finance or private finance.
Well, I think what's interesting about the 21st century is those boundaries get really fuzzy. That this is a build, operate, and transfer sewage plant that will transfer to wherever it will transfer to in the 20 or 30 years it takes for the project to be built out. And by then, hopefully, some sovereign authority will take it. And you know, that's the solution set, or the solution idea. So it's a build, operate, transfer, and the transfer is put off to when there is some final status agreement. Meanwhile, the corporation operates, and tourism can start to create conditions of economic development, which would hopefully enhance rather than limit the alternatives.
And near Almog kibbutz, downstream, there is a huge, big wastewater treatment plant, which is collecting all of this wastewater, treating it, using it in irrigating of dates. Let's say this is one node. So at the end, water is treated, unfortunately, not perhaps after being flowing at the open, creating a lot of environmental hazard. From another point of view, we noticed that the whole Kidron Valley, the whole Wadi al-Nar Valley, exists within the Palestinian West Bank territory. It is in Area B and Area C.
Right.
And why you think that the Israeli government would give the opportunity and would allow the Palestinian Water Authority to do its homework to construct the wastewater collection system and the wastewater treatment plant since it is in Palestinian territory. Thank you.
Well, it seems like both of those, you know, the Palestinian Water Authority and the Israeli Water Authority, again, have been part of the problem, not part of the solution. And this is an option, and they haven't been doing their homework. That's what I find amazing about it. That's really the call to action, is that the people in this room, or the people in this greater Berkeley community, as Dean was describing it, or this international community that has an interest and that wants to go there and participate and see that history, see that culture, that they can have a stake in solving that problem. Because the homework doesn't get done at the authority levels. It just hasn't been done until now. And the sewage hookups are definitely a part of the issue. A part of the financing here would go for the sewage hookups that would be in Al-Badia and Besahur and these other areas. And then, you know, perhaps, I don't know, there may be alternative questions about where you would put in gray water recycling and some of these other types of solution sets which aren't in this model at all. So, I mean, that's one for you guys would have to figure out, or take some of these students, because you and I don't have the manpower to do it, and to put them to work, the Palestinian, Israeli, or American students to work on that, and come up with the business models that would be financeable. But yes, it goes through A, B, and C, and I don't know what to do about that. I mean, we've all been, have our hearts broken about that, you know, for the last 20 years. So the question is, you know, what do we do now? And this is something that can be done. This is something that can be implemented.
Hi, I think you partly answered my question, but I want to push it a little further. I'm stuck back with the need for the sewage hookups in East Jerusalem. And you just said that would be part of the $150 million or $100 million project. Then I wondered about the informal housing. And I'd like a little discourse on that, because I'm still stuck in the details at the source.
The property rights are very key here in terms of where those, that's one of those things that have to be, that's another legal issue that I really am not in a position to comment on. But clearly there's housing shortages all over the area. There's,
the reality, I believe that Jerusalem municipality is responsible for the pollutants. And I have heard in the beginning of today that the pollutant should pay. And in this case, the Jerusalem municipality take taxes from the people who are living here for wastewater treatment. And why they did not build a wastewater treatment plant in this Kidron Valley? I believe because they are not harming the Israelis. The whole Kidron Valley flow in the Palestinian area. And this is one, it could be one the reason that the Israelis are not interested in building wastewater treatment plant in that area.
Lots of, the blame game just can take us so far, so this is an attempt to try to go beyond that and say this is something that's financeable that could be done. It requires some delegation.
Haven't asked one all day. I'm wondering about the ecotourism question and the risks involved with that. I mean, even if we think about state parks here, national parks, and the whole balancing act between the ecosystem and environmental beauty, and then drawing tourists to those areas, and that concern that would kind of add to those, an already vulnerable area. And then I'm also wondering, as a separate question, if there's time to even address it, what other projects that we might have heard about today flow from this one, other transboundary watershed projects that came up today, that this could, if coming to realization, could be a model for?
It's not like there's not a really high level of unemployment in the Palestinian Authority. I mean, their jobs, cleaning up the waste and building the plant's going to create a lot of jobs. Dealing with the solid waste and conversion of solid waste into usable resources, those are all job-creating mechanisms. And certainly, security in the park is another area. That's something that should be financed within. Right now, it'll be sort of extreme tourism, I'll admit, but the people are going down on their mountain bikes. It's only 22 kilometers. I hiked it once a long time ago. It's done 16 meters of water, and 12 meters of water, 16 hours to walk it. But it's definitely a manageable project. The other types of things that flow from it, agriculture is clearly an outcome of it. the applications, again, of solid waste recycling as well as the wastewater recycling and the agriculture that derives from that. Great applications for solar, for the aerobic biodigesters, some of which that have been put in and Clyde were talking about greywater applications. There's all sorts of technology applications. The energy, the solar alone would be a very cool thing to start to develop that would create savings and in areas which aren't served, and all sorts of other whatever people can imagine. It gets back to another notion of environmental imagining, which is not meant pejoratively.